All right, let's get started, everyone. Hello, and thank you for tuning in today for our workshop focusing on recently built K-12 schools. I'm Katya Osukin. I'm project manager at Climate Challenge Network. Our workshop today will include insights and strategies for building highly energy efficient schools. And the workshop is part of our larger project, Foundations for Net Zero Buildings, which is funded by Natural Resources Canada through their Codes Acceleration Fund. For any questions, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many as we can during the panel discussion that we'll have later on. And just to mention that this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting it to our Climate Challenge Network website in the next week or two. I'll start with the land acknowledgement. This is a virtual event and we have attendees from many provinces across Canada on traditional lands of many Indigenous peoples. Our team, Climate Challenge Network, will be speaking from the Toronto area, the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River, governed by Treaty 13. We hope that the work we do today is a meaningful contribution to our collective responsibility as stewards of the environment. A quick introduction of some of our team. Ian Jarvis is the Executive Director at Climate Challenge Network. He'll be covering much of the presentation today, as well as moderating the panel discussion. Jillian Henderson is the Executive Lead on this project. I'm Katya Osukin. And Mark Mahdi and Kajan Singham are the technical leads on this work. Mark is focusing on education facilities. Also wanted to mention they are not listed here, but we also have many other team members who contributed greatly to various aspects of this project. Without them, this work would not have been possible. And with that, I'll hand this over to Ian Jarvis to start with the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Katya, and good morning, all the folks from Alberta and British Columbia that I know are on the call today, and good afternoon to everybody else. Let me just give you a walkthrough what we're going to try to accomplish today. I'm going to spend a bit of time on where this project came from, and essentially what is the problem that's been identified here that merits the time of everybody that's joining this call today to engage with us on. And the context of this workshop today is anything but we've reached conclusions and here's all we have to do to meet the goals that have been set out for this work. This is very much a request, an invitation for people to join the work that's ongoing, to meet with us, to discuss with us, to share your insights. So want to make clear that this is more of a call to action than a presentation of results. We're going to dive right into the data. What does benchmarking show us? How efficient are schools? How consistently efficient are new schools that are being built? The timeline is since 2015. We use that as a logical threshold for what we're categorizing as new buildings right now. What have we learned so far? And these learnings are only just beginning from the good ones and the less good ones. And so far, what are we seeing are the characteristics of the most efficient schools. I'll then pass this over to my colleague Kajan, who will speak to the whole area of policy, codes, standards. What is that landscape? We at Climate Challenge Network see this as profoundly important. It's a major foundation for achieving and sustaining high performance buildings, is getting the whole upfront codes and standards work right. We're very conscious of all the great work going on across the country, and we hope that this will contribute meaningfully towards that. Kajan will then head into Mark, who, as Katya mentioned, is leading the education sector. We're looking at colleges as well as schools, K-12 schools, but looking to the whole process, where schools have turned out very efficiently, especially when one board is delivering consistently efficient. What are the strengths of their process? And where schools have not turned out so well, what went wrong? Where are the points of failure that should be addressed coming out of this work? Mark will share with us the different approaches that different provinces are taken to the delivery model. He'll also cover what we think is important and what we're just beginning around geothermal, like where does it fit on a national and a provincial scale, and how significant can that be for K-12 schools in particular on a go-forward basis. Then we'll get into a panel discussion. I'm personally delighted with the panel that we have. We have government and school boards represented. But this, again, is a conversation. It's not a presentation. So there's an audience poll attached to this. We'll be asking everybody on this call to share their thoughts, their insights, their ideas that will get folded into how this work unfolds over the balance of 2025. And then I'm going to spend a moment talking about next steps. Where do we go from here? What's coming next? So that's our plan for the day. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as always, where is this coming from, and what do you need to know to hopefully make sense of the work we're doing? It starts with Climate Challenge Network. I am the executive director, and my colleagues all work for Climate Challenge Network. It's a national nonprofit organization, and we're all about data, and we're all about greenhouse gas emissions reductions. That is the sole purpose of Climate Challenge Network, is developing collaborative, working together models and approaches using data. And we'll share some of the data that are at play here and how you, as well as we, can use them. But the whole goal is to achieve and sustain deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions in buildings. You can see we've got programs in hospitals, in municipalities and colleges, as well as in schools. The organizations become part of Climate Challenge Network because they're interested in the things that are laid out in the middle paragraph there. But coming out of the data is all kinds of anomalies and questions that arise. And Climate Challenge Network does a lot of primary research. We'll share a little bit of that. And this project is part of that primary research. Why are things the way they are? What can be done to make things turn out in a more positive way in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and seriously addressing climate change? The next slide, please. You'll find, this is the address of the Sustainable Schools website. You'll find our research reports there. They're publicly available. Everything we do, we put up into the public sphere. For a second from the left there, our most recent production with the help of the Independent Electric System Operator in Ontario and Enbridge Gas is looking at an application guide or developing an application guide for air source heat pumps. It's a follow-on from previous work on the left there on major capital projects replacing HVAC equipment. In that case, it was rooftop units. And when that equipment gets replaced, is it accompanied by energy savings? On the right side is work we did, again, with the Independent Electric System Operator on strategic energy management. What are the organizational and management attributes of the most energy efficient school boards? And the foundation of that is the second report you'll see from the right. And there's a series of annual reports there ranking the relative energy efficiency of all 72 school boards in Ontario. So every year we run, there's about 4,500 school buildings in Ontario. We run all the numbers. We compare them to, if you like, archetypal targets, adjust for weather differences, assess the efficiency of all 4,500 buildings, then roll them up by board to say, which are the most efficient boards? And we recognize those every year in this report. You'll find this latest report there, Halton Catholic School Board is at the top of the charts there. And I'm delighted we got Steve Allen with us today from Halton Catholic to speak to the performance and practices around their new buildings. But we believe this research is a useful contributor to where we're going, and encourage people to go take a look at the website. Next slide, please. And within that research, the CAF Foundations project is just one. It's an important one. It's 3 years over 5 provinces and 6 different building types. And the summary you can read for yourself. Benchmarking, in the case of schools, we have over 200 newly constructed school buildings that we'll share data from in just a moment. With each building type, we're documenting the top performing buildings and what makes them really, really good, and the underperforming buildings and where we believe the failure points came, and that we're examining with each of selected boards and organizations that are part of this work. The deliverables are resources that are listed there. We want to develop useful materials and resources we can provide to school boards and to design teams to help them do a consistently good job going forward. We will be getting involved with new buildings that are still at the planning stage to bring some of the metrics, some of the data, and some of the insights we're providing into that process and hopefully demonstrate better outcomes. And we'll be looking at some underperforming buildings to document what went wrong. So that's the simple context of CAF Foundations for Net Zero Buildings. Next slide, please. We are very conscious how busy the K-12 school sector and governments are these days. And I just want to acknowledge the generosity of all these organizations and how much time they've been willing to share with us with our kind of endless questions. And we don't know what we need to find out until we've asked questions. Then there are more questions and more questions. And that's the way this is going to unfold. And we'll be looking from here on in through 2025 to engaging more organizations. But I really want to give a shout out to all of these organizations to this point that have helped us so much. Next slide, please. And in terms of where we are, the K-12 school stream is 24-25. The project continues after that with some of the other building sectors. And this in the green box there is the scope of work that we'll be doing. And in particular, there'll be more stakeholder meetings following on from this workshop. Through the whole process, it's getting people involved, reaching out, generosity of their time. We have an advisory group of government and other bodies across that can really help guide us on where best to do this. We're spending a lot of time with standards and with the National Energy Code archetypes. But the italicized word there is discovery. We're learning every day and every week and looking to share what we're learning with everybody. And this workshop is a key part of that. This is what we've found so far. The other building types, say hospitals and commercial office buildings, are also in progress right now. And the other 3 sectors are just beginning the work. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a lot today about what in terms of codes, what in terms of standards, what in terms of processes, what in terms of, in some cases, technologies, like the what. And there's a lot of conversation today about the how. To get different outcomes, we need to do things differently. We're going to spend a lot of time for how. But those of you who are familiar with our various workshops and webinars will have seen this slide before, and this is all about the why. So the why is looking deeply at, and we spent a lot of time trying to capture this onto one slide, because we could spend the whole hour and a half that we have here talking about the challenges that are coming around climate change and around the difficulties of weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. But these 3 statements are key. Climate change is the defining issue of our times. Through the history of humankind, we've always had wars. We have periodic pandemics, which are horrific and take many, many lives. But they come to an end. Even with great respect, tariffs and trade wars will come to an end. The climate change is with us for good. It's a major wrench, and it will cause both economic and social disruption and the worst is yet to come. From the education sector standpoint, you're developing the young people who are inheriting the damage that previous generations, including my own, have done. I have 9 grandchildren. I have these conversations with them. You'll be dealing not just with the physical effects, smoke, but with the mental health effects, which are becoming increasingly clear. This is a cloud for everybody to work under. So the defining issue of our time, we have to take it seriously, despite political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, technology that may come to help, but we can't rely upon. The second key point here is we're on the wrong trajectory. The COP conferences every year set goals, they set targets. But as far as commercial and institutional buildings are concerned, emissions continue to rise, and not just based on new buildings that are being built as the population grows. With the present trajectory, we will miss 2030 targets by a wide margin. If we miss 2030, we believe it will be very difficult to meet 2040 and impossible to meet 2050. We've got to start taking action, and we've got to do it right now. And the third point that we think is critical is governments can't fix this. They have a very important role to play, but they can't make this fix. It's down to all of us. Every government individual, every policy, every program design, every school board, every school, every individual has a role to play in closing this gap. And the context for this, why we do this work, why we are really honored that you're willing to join us today, is the urgency is real, the opportunity to make a difference is real, and the responsibility to act now is very real. That is why we're doing what we're doing today. Next slide, please. So let's dive into the data. So here we have elementary schools separated from secondary schools. You'll see from the decile, quartile, median numbers on the 2 slides, they're a little different. Every horizontal line is a school. The blue is the electricity use. The orange is the thermal energy use. And this is not weather normalized data. We are weather normalizing targets when we have conversations with the school boards and organizations. But you'll see the zones, the lighter colors are the milder climates, the darker colors are the darker climates. And without trying to tease all of this apart, you can see that we've got dark, shaded, more severe climates at the top of this chart, and we've got some light shaded, less severe at the bottom of this chart. So even after we adjust for weather, there are substantial variances. And you can see we've got schools running at more than 20 equivalent kilowatt hours per square foot per year and below 5. The Model National Energy Code Tier 1, you see on the left-hand side. So that's minimum. That's you shouldn't get a building permit if you're not there. We are producing schools that are substantially below that. The encouraging part is Tiers 3 and 4, and Cajun will be developing this more. At the top of this chart, we've got schools that we built already that meet those extreme tiers. So we know how to do this. The key message for me, we know how to do it. We just need to do what we know how to do and do it consistently well. And we think we can do that best by sharing. Similar chart for secondary schools. And once again, there's less of these. But once again, you can see the National Energy Code. And by the way, it got too busy, but we can put the Toronto Green Standard on here. We can put British Columbia STEP on here. So wherever there are metrics available, you can put them on this chart. But say the encouraging news for everybody on this call is we do know how to do this. We can build highly efficient schools already. We're just at this point not doing so consistently. And a large number of schools can perform better than they are today. And we believe by modifying the overall process, by engaging all the stakeholders, we can get all of the schools to the top of these charts. Next slide, please. So this is the simple, big idea that going forward, if we can't get the new buildings right, where we're spending tens of millions, in the case of hospitals, we're spending sometimes more than $1 billion on a new facility. And everybody's intention is to make them efficient. If we can't get them right, we're going to struggle to deal with the massive number of existing buildings. So the big idea here is we can use metrics and practices from the top performers to help raise the water level, make everybody improve. It's going to lead to systemic change, fundamentally doing things differently than we've done them before. And we've included here, and this slide deck will be available to everybody online afterwards. This is what National Energy Code speaks to and what the archetype models speak to. So next slide, please. Cajun and his team are documenting this. So this is very early findings so far, but for your reference, coming out of the National Energy Code on the left-hand column there is what is specified as typically the minimum standard. NECB is the minimum standard column in the middle. And we're starting to document what's coming out of top performing schools. Where are they different? And that is the information we'll be making available to everybody as this work unfolds. And the next slide. Final, if there's a takeaway, we'd leave people with interval metering, having electric and thermal energy, typically natural gas metering that's measuring every 15 minutes that you can look at hourly data. This is some of the content that we're getting out of working with individual boards that have this capability. And without dwelling on it, you can see the blue dots are the electricity use. Every hour, how much is used. The red dots are how much gas consumption was used on the coldest day of the year. And following these is the best way to commission a new school. If you know how much electricity, gas you're using in the middle of the night, you can compare that to your model. If you know how much you're using during the day, you can compare that to the model. So so if there's one takeaway for all the school boards and other players today, let's get interval metering in place so that we can properly make sure that every new school going forward meets the design intent at this degree of granularity. Next slide, please. So let me pass this to my colleague, Cajun. Tell us a bit about codes and standards, how all this fits together as ideally a foundation for producing highly efficient buildings.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, hi everyone. To go into some ideas of giving context about the NECB and green standard certifications. NECB was developed as a model national code quite a while back. Developed through 2011, 2015. Had a middle ground in 2017, 2020, and it's going to have a new one 2025 coming up soon. Provinces and a lot of authorities having jurisdiction, they can make amendments, make changes as they want to make it more strict or more relaxed as they need. The primary point or the purpose of the code is to help on the building permit side, find out, are you building buildings that meet a minimum standard for the country? And different jurisdictions can adopt that. And some jurisdictions in Canada haven't adopted any codes. They, use what makes sense for them in their locations. The 2020 version has introduced a tiered structure. Tier 1 is the baseline, improved from the 2017 version slightly. And then there's the tiered versions, which is looking at giving people options of phasing in harder tiers over time. So tier 2 is 25% better, tier 3, 50, and tier 4 is 60% better. The intention is, over time, we'll be aiming towards net zero ready buildings so we can prepare the building industry to have that capability and capacity to build these. Future versions, like the NECB 2025 version that's coming out soon in the next few years, are looking to add absolute energy use intensities. They already have, shared in their public reviews some of the values like we've seen for schools, and Ian has presented as one of the options on the charts. And they're looking at operational carbon goals. So there's a lot of new progressive goals being set That's going to be more in alignment with the rest of the world and with our ambitious targets. Just to give some context on the general direction of a lot of green standards and certifications, there's more movement towards total energy use intensities, thermal energy demand intensities, greenhouse gas intensities, to give people an idea of what to target. There's a bit of a move. There's still the option to use relative performance pathways, but these absolute performance pathways give people the ability to look at these different approaches. Certification programs like the CAGBC's zero carbon building also provides one of these as an option or a pathway for like having TEDI values to be able to meet certain goals. And many municipalities are also working towards their own green standards, adding their own archetype buildings, whether it's community centers, schools, office towers, MERBs, with GHGI targets, TEDI targets, EY targets. Next slide, please. I can't mention NECB's tiers without mentioning what really inspired the tiers. So BC Step Code has been one of the most progressive codes that's helped inspire a lot of things throughout the country. And I would say it started out a while back. They introduced their steps. They have a mix of relative performance, so using the codes and absolute targets. They're also using a tiered progressive code structure that gets more stringent as time goes on and you take off the most current tiers. The intention is to prepare, again, local new construction industry to gradually improve their buildings and become more net zero ready in the future. The Toronto Green Standard followed a similar pathway. The only difference is the BC Step Code also goes until the building performance section, but Toronto Green Standard is mainly for the site plan approval and the pre-building permit stage phases. 4 building permit phases in Ontario or in Toronto is still using SB10, which is a little bit behind, but we'll talk about that in the next slide. And I just want to mention that Toronto Green Standard does also have a focus on several archetype buildings. That's where they provide more stringent targets for EY and TEDI and GHGI using these absolute performance targets. It's also tiered, so as things develop and newer versions get adopted, the old tiers get dropped off, and people kind of see where the direction is heading and what they should be aiming for when those newer versions get adopted, and how to prepare better by improving, being innovative, and working on developing improved and better designs and using best practice. Next slide, please. So a short summary on some of the policy regulations and incentives that we found. We're doing a lot of more research into the policy side of things, so we'll find out more for these provinces. And for this study, we're looking at British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. We know that British Columbia has adopted the NECB 2020 for a lot of their building types and using ASHRAE 90.1 2019. Alberta has adopted the NECB 2020 version of for the energy code. Manitoba has adopted 2020 for their NECB. Ontario decided not to do that. They're one of the few that's hasn't adopted the 2020 code, at least in this study right here. We have SB10. They have amendments to the NECB 2015 and ASHRAE 90.1. So they did improve some of the aspects, making it a little bit stricter in some aspects. Nova Scotia will be adopting the NECB 2020 Tier 1. So these are all Tier 1 I'm talking about. And that's going to be effective in April 1st, so in a few days from now. For the new construction incentives, there's a lot of great incentives out there. British Columbia and Manitoba, I would say, stand out with having some really progressive incentives, going into details of performance and occupancy, and a very healthy amount of incentives to encourage people to build new buildings that are very energy efficient. Ontario and Nova Scotia have some portions, some incentives for new construction on the design phase, especially when it comes to the energy modeling portion and developing, pathways to help become more energy efficient. Alberta has emissions reductions Alberta. There's a lot of municipal funding for retrofits, but not so much on the new construction side. And this is a very high level for just the major provinces, or like on the provincial level. There's a lot more incentives. We've included some additional links on the side where NRCan has published, their incentive directories that have more detailed breakdown of different incentives on a municipal basis, national basis, provincial basis. There's also more resources to help with energy efficiency in buildings that NRCan has published and has been linked on the side over here. So this is an overall idea. There's going to be continual improvement as we do our research and understand better on the policy landscape of these different provinces and find ways that we can help provide some information that can help develop and feed into the development of these policies and regulations. With that said, if anyone has any questions, please, throw it in the chat, and I'll hand it off to Mark to continue on for the process flow. Thank you.
Thank you, Kajan. So we're going to discuss the project development process in brief. So we chose to represent the whole project life cycle under 10 phases, but I'm sure you're familiar with different types with less number of stages, where stages or phases could have been combined. The intent here is not to dive into the details of each and every phase, but rather to focus on what could go wrong in the process, where important considerations are overlooked or not properly addressed, which would lead at the end of the day to an efficient building, construction, or operation, or sometimes both. And of course, that would translate to increased costs and performance gaps down the road. So in the first stage, pre-planning and policy, so the most important thing is to have alignment between the different stakeholders. So to ensure that, for example, when planning a new school, which is identified typically based on a need study, that school would allow future expansion, for example, if that is required. Under project inception and planning, it's very important to highlight the energy and sustainability goals so that these gets accounted for in the budget. For example, enhanced insulation for buildings or highly efficient HVAC systems, the different kind of envelope testing, and of course, performance commissioning to ensure that the building operates as intended. During the design stage, so during design engineering stage, it's very important to have energy models reflecting realistic assumptions. For example, scheduling, occupancy, lighting densities, and of course, these should be coordinated with school boards. Project specifications should clearly highlight energy performance targets so that they get included as part of the tender documents. And we should be aware of trade-offs on the expense of efficiency, whether during value engineering activities, which we know sometimes end up just cutting costs without really giving importance to energy efficiency measures. Moving on to the tendering and procurement stage, selection should prioritize qualification and expertise of the bidders, compliance with the tender documents in general, and energy performance requirements in specific. Of course, with a fair and acceptable budget, but it shouldn't be only based on lowest bid. As for the construction stage, so proper supervision is required to avoid poor construction. Few examples here like thermal bridging and air leakage due to improperly installed windows, for example, which would directly affect energy performance And that would force actually the HVAC system to compensate for these increased loads. Again, during this change order, which would compromise energy efficiency, should be avoided. And we've seen change orders being part of design, part of tendering, and part of construction. So lots of room to do changes to the original design that would impact energy performance. During testing, adjusting, balancing, and commissioning stage, it's important to ensure all systems are properly tested and calibrated. And we've seen that most of the projects where they go behind in schedules, they tend to rush the stage. And lots of systems go without proper testing or commissioning. In addition, performance commissioning is also recommended to ensure not only system operate as intended, but also to react to changing operating conditions. So it's about having the performance verified over an extended period of time. During the handover and training stage, it is substantial that operators and school boards get necessary training to make them comfortable operating, maintaining, and making changes as needed, especially for the BAS systems. This is unfortunately where we see buildings well designed and well constructed, even well commissioned, would start their downfall. As sensors, dampers, and accessories drift after a certain time and require recalibration to ensure consistent performance, this is why continuous measurement and verification plan is recommended to be implemented during operation. So during occupancy and operation, it's very important to have also a set point override management. And we noticed in many of the existing schools that once set points are overridden, possibly for different reasons, really cold days or special events, they do not reset to their original set points, and the system end up working not as intended. And last but not least, during the last stage of life cycle operation, and we called it life cycle operation, we mean by it extended operation of the building till the project ceases to exist, is measurement and verification again. So this is a crucial component, because without this process, operation is to a certain extent blind and does not have the means to identify sources of drift in operations and to ensure consistent energy performance. Also, you can notice an arrow that closes the loop between the life cycle and policy. And what we mean by that is that typically real-world performance data, lessons learned, and long-term operation consideration would feed into changes in policies. Next slide, please. So this table actually summarizes for several provinces, as we see, who is involved or responsible for the different stages of school project development from inception all the way to operation. And we want to focus here on the funding and deliveries, construction delivery model specifically. So for example, in Ontario, the Ministry of Education funds the projects and the school boards handle the construction through what is called a DBB model, which is a design bid build, the standard model of delivery. And what that means is that there are 3 stages in the construction process. So the first is the design, where the school board hires consultants, architects, engineering firms to do the design and come up with the tender documents. And then there's the bidding stage, where a successful bidder is selected, who becomes a contractor to perform the construction stage according to the tender documents. And of course, the school board handles and oversees the construction process and handles the operation at the end. This is pretty much similar in British Columbia and Quebec. They follow pretty much the same. The Ministry of Education for both also handle or provide the funding. What's a bit special in Alberta is that although the DBB model is also used for smaller projects, but for large bundle of schools and projects, a P3 model is adopted, which is a public-private partnership. And what that means is that the initial funding of the project comes from a consortium of private sector entities that would fund, design, build, operate the buildings. Typically, the contracts for P3 are 30 years long. So they would handle everything all the way 30 years after construction, including operation and maintenance, which is then handed over back to the school divisions here. And for Alberta, the funding is coming from Alberta Education. Manitoba, on the other hand, uses a combination of P3 and DBB models, and the funding comes from public school finance boards. Nova Scotia mainly uses the DBB model, but what's special is that the Department of Public Works handles the construction process. So it does hire designers and follow up all the way to construction delivery. Of course, the regional centers, which are the equivalent of school divisions or school boards, do follow up and interact throughout the process, and at the end, handles the operation. Next, please. This is the same we already discussed. Next one, please. Now, talking about the geothermal case, specifically for school. We know that geothermal shined like back in 1990s all the way to maybe 2010 and was one of the most important and decarbonization solution. And we still consider it a complete decarbonization solution. What we mean by that is that it does not rely on supplementary or auxiliary energy sources, and it works well for cold climate. So it offers an efficient year-round heating and cooling, even during peak demand periods. Unlike, for example, which is also a good way of handling decarbonization, the air source heat pumps, geothermal systems have the potential to reduce peak electrical load, which is growing concern in electrification strategies. That said, and despite the technical advantages, it comes at a cost premium and is subject to operational challenges. The upfront capital costs are a known barrier, and long-term economic benefits are not certain, given that it relies solely on electricity, and changes in rates or rate structures would affect the economics. Through our research so far, we came across several schools with geothermal systems, some at the top of the benchmark, and some are towards the middle, which raises important questions. So where do things go wrong? What factors lead to underperformance? And more importantly, how can we ensure more consistent success? So as we move forward in the next stage of the study, we will be focusing on uncovering these risks from design to operation and maintenance. And our goal will be to identify the critical failure points and find strategies to address them to help ensure that geothermal remains a viable, effective, and scalable solution for decarbonizing schools and other cold climate buildings. Back to you, Ian. Thank you.
Before we start our next section, just wanted to remind everyone, please submit your questions through the Q&A. So that way we actually will have records of them, and we'll be able to follow up with you afterwards if we don't get to your question. Over to you, Ian.
Yeah, Katya, thanks for that. I was just going to make the same comment as we probably want to emphasize this more at the outset. By the end of this session, we lose the chat. Well, the chat disappears. We can try to print it off, but the Q&A is what we use as the reference document for answering questions in a bit more detail. It becomes part of the record of the meeting. So as Katya just mentioned, please put your questions into the Q&A, not the chat. You can find it in the same place down at the bottom there. It's and there's one in there already. You see, we're winning. Just want to Before we move into the panel discussion, I want to make clear this is a conversation among everybody on this call. So, the caution on Q&A, we expect a lot more questions to come during this session. If you hear things that are provocative or you can elaborate upon, and it is questions and comments we're looking for in Q&A. So feel free, please, to share all of your thoughts, all of your ideas in the Q&A as that unfolds. If I could summarize what I've heard from Cajun and Mark so far, with schools these days, we're probably spending $10 or $20 million to put a new school up, and the cradle-to-cradle approach, which is in that process diagram, is that we almost want to be planning and designing a school, contemplating that at some point in the future it's going to need to be replaced or substantially picked up on. We talked a lot about delivery models and provincial differences. And Adrian, thanks for your feedback. I've been following that as we've gone through. These are evolving really quickly. So everybody's on this horse and looking to adapt and evolve, both at the national energy code level, at the regional level, and more cities getting involved with, let's make sure we get this right. I think it's fair to say it's not clear to us yet if one delivery model is preferred over another in terms of outcomes, but we hope to get some of that. The other comment I'd add is Climate Challenge Network is looking at geothermal this year. So the idea of an application guide, again, the successful installations, what made them good, the ones that have failed and sometimes been abandoned, what happened there. Because we do believe, as Mark was saying very, very eloquently, geothermal could be a big part of the solution for K-12 schools, which don't have high internal heat gains for most of the time. The heat from the ground is a wonderful option if we can make it work technically and financially. But let's move on to our panelists. And once again, my sincere thanks, not just for spending the time and sharing your insights, your thoughts, your ideas today, but also the prep work that we've done leading up to this. You can see the names Hassan from Calgary. Calgary submitted the most new schools to the research that we've done to this point. And Hassan, I think it's fair to say you've got some really good ones in your list, and you've got some that didn't turn out so well. And really looking forward, you've got such a rich personal history in this space. Really looking forward to your insights on when they go well, what happens when they go less well, what gets in the way. Andrea will be leading off with you shortly, but really happy to have government there and really impressed with what Nova Scotia is looking to do to move the agenda and how things are unfolding there. Luke has a really long tradition with sustainability from most parts of the world, but at the North Vancouver School District, we're intrigued with the efficiency of some of the schools, but also some of the innovations. And second shout out to Steve. Halton Catholic District School Board has been our most energy efficient school board for most of the last 7 years we've been reporting in Ontario, and just delighted to have your experience on the panel, especially at the kind of commissioning and operational phases of things. So welcome to our panelists. And again, the invitation to everybody on the call, you don't have to agree with everything that comes here, but we will absolutely treasure your feedback in the Q&A, and we'll promise to respond either during the session or following this as part of the record. Next slide, please, because let's talk about some of the questions. So as we've been working this around us to where do we think the big influence points are? Where are the things that when they're right, when they're wrong, they're wrong? And we ended up with 4 categories, really 3 categories and 1 question. So provincial policy, regulations, incentives, we ran through those with Cajun. So what are they? Where are they different from a school board standpoint? Where do they help from Andrea's standpoint in the government? How do you see the regulatory framework setting the stage for more efficient outcomes? The responsibilities is kind of who does what, all the way from the beginning who actually builds the schools, who funds the schools, and Cajun presented some of those results. What codes and standards are boards using? It's not a standard, but where does LEED fit into this? Does that correlate with where we're going? How much do the provinces and the boards specify their standards, both in terms of design and operations, and how much our consultants relied upon to do that? And are consultants ready for that? Are they in good position? I know we've got a number of them on this call today, and love to hear from you as this unfolds. And within the individual boards, the design construction group sometimes is quite different than the facility operations. How well is that integrated? How does facility operations have a seat at the table as some of the big decisions are made? Want to get back to, we looked at the project development process, want to talk about where are the strengths, where are the failure points? Like what happens when schools don't turn out well? And finally, and I'm going to ask this about 3/4 of the way through, because every time we engage in one of these workshops, one of the strongest responses, we can't afford to build efficiently. And so do highly efficient, low carbon schools really cost more? And especially highly efficient, the ones we've seen here. And if not, what are the other key factors involved there? So I want to start, if I may, Andrew, with you. Nova Scotia is doing some interesting things around policy and regulation. Can you give us a bit of an overview of where you're at and where you're going and what you think is working and what can be improved?
So in Nova Scotia, I guess what's driving the sustainability is the Sustainability Act, the Sustainability Goals Act, and that's driving the reduction of carbon in the schools. So it's driving us to be trying to build our schools more efficiently. We're trying to set some, I think, targets for our EUIs as we move along. We also, our other policies that we have is we have a kind of an outdated LEED policy, which states that we have to achieve at least a minimum of LEED silver or 2 green globes. There's a lot of challenges in Nova Scotia that are restricting us, and it's hard to get gold right now as in LEED. And I think that around that is maybe the carbon issue. Like our carbon is so much more, or our energy is so much more carbon intensive. We have really restrictive sites. We have a lot of rock, so geothermal is difficult to do.
Yep. That helps. So where do you see the policy direction going from here, Andrea?
Well, we're kind of directed, or we're being directed to go electric. So we're going to be focusing more on heat pumps. I think the first thing we got to start looking at is geothermal here, but because of cost and soil conditions, heat pumps are our next best option. But that's the direction that government is going, and going all electric, because the government they're cleaning up the grid, and I think by 2050 the grid is supposed to be clean, but it's substantially, as you know, it's substantially dirtier than Manitoba or Quebec, like by 500 times.
Okay, so conscious of the challenges in Nova Scotia, that a lot of the province doesn't have even natural gas. And as you say, you've got a pretty rocky terrain. So yeah. Decarbonization means a whole lot different things to you than Luke. If we could pick up with you, what's it like living under a really assertive decarbonization climate action regime that you have in British Columbia? What's working, and again, what there could be improved from a policy regulatory support standpoint?
You make it sound like some sort of repressive situation, but it's great to be operating in such a supportive policy environment. I think, as we've seen in the comparison, BC does stand out as having some really progressive thinking. And Adrian, we're lucky to have Adrian Mahara from the Climate Action Secretariat on the call today, and he shared what's sort of the latest and greatest with regard to the framework that supports new capital projects, and that's the ESG framework. And there's a lot there in terms of what it's trying to achieve with decarbonisation, with other aspects of building performance and future readiness. So we've been able to develop a couple of projects in recent years that were slightly in advance of that framework being fully adopted, or the projects weren't required to follow that. But we've really tried as a school board to push forward even in advance of those requirements.
That's helpful. Hassan, moving to Calgary just for a moment. So you got a large number of schools in here, and you made the comment when we had our prep meeting that some turn out differently. What have you learned in terms of what goes well, where the challenges might be, and how perhaps processes might be improved on a go-forward basis?
So for Calgary Board of Education, I think we have a large portfolio of schools, upwards of about like 250 schools or more that we are managing at this time. But at the same time, for the newer schools, we have a minimum standard, just like Andrea was mentioning. LEED Silver is what we're targeting. However, what we have observed is just because we're targeting LEED Silver, sometimes when we're doing the design work, which is being done by AI and the consultants, what has happened in the past is we target specific items in the energy section. But once we go into operation, what we found is we could not actually run them as per the design requirement, because maybe it was not efficient enough to do them that way. Also, at the same time, what has happened is there was a disconnect between the design side and the operation side. So for example, whatever feedback we were giving, we were not probably seeing them reflected on the side of when the LEED Silver was being basically being planned as far as the credits were concerned. At the same time, I think what we are trying to do, like, because that process probably didn't work out better, what we proactively has been doing from CBE's side is we are now trying to do in the design stage something like an MNV process being implemented. So again, we are trying to do a better measurement and verification process. So again, during the design process, we are talking about how are we going to do the measure and verification once that process is implemented, like the LEED Silver. So that is the step we're trying to do in order to make sure that we can do it something better. So that's kind of like how it's a way forward for us for new projects that we're planning.
That's a great overview, Hassan. And Steve, that's almost the perfect segue for you, isn't it? Again, highly efficient schools. All four of the schools you have in this project are in the well into the top quartile, and one's right at the top. This whole operational, like, we're speculating without preempting the process that it's energy targets, commissioning, operator training, building automation system operations. That transition to operations is such a big deal. How does Halton Catholic manage that?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think we manage it as a small but capable and very agile group. I think we pride ourselves in our agility as a small group to not get too bogged down in in plethora of meetings, and we all are capable at our job, and we take pride in it, I would say, and the key decision-making capabilities that we have in our various roles transition and translate, I should say, into the efficient buildings that you're referring to. Without getting into the weeds too much, we definitely do have some different philosophies here on how to do construction management for our schools, and we feel like we realize some savings from that philosophy and quicker approvals and turnaround time, and you build a school faster, and you get better pricing usually, and allows us to allocate funding to the more premium HVAC systems that we put in our schools, and as well do the like you were saying, Ian, more of the building commissioning, continuous commissioning, interval monitoring for all of our schools, and that seems to have paid dividends for us for the last number of years.
Again, it's almost like we rehearsed this. The the mention of the cost of putting improved HVAC equipment, which will have a life cycle cost bearing there. Interested in exploring that is, and maybe I'd ask the panelists, is life cycle costing required? Is it part of the work? Maybe I'll start with you, Lucas. Are the engineers you're using able to perform that for you? Do you look at those options? I saw a comment a moment ago from Alberta Infrastructure that they're struggling to make geothermal work. So life cycle costing, where does that fit, Luke, for North Vancouver?
It's a great question. So one of the really interesting things in the project's initiation phase is that life cycle costing or net present value is leaned on heavily to determine the best path for a project. And so if we took an example of rehabilitating an existing structure or building a new school, really the province looks at lowest net present value as almost the sole determining factor to figure out which is the preferred path. But ironically, when it comes into evaluating design decisions and different options, I don't see the same importance put on life cycle costing. So I think that's where there's a huge opportunity to look at that. I think we're getting there when we're starting to look at things like embodied carbon, which is another area where BC's really, starting to excel. The City of Vancouver is really pushing that for certain typologies. But I think that really is the next stage of analysis that's required. I will say that I don't think the life cycle implications of even some of the newer technologies are fully understood or appreciated when it comes to things like heat pumps or geothermal. What does the life cycle look like there in terms of the key parts of the infrastructure, the machines, the heat pumps, and the geofield loops, things like that. But I do see it as being an opportunity to bring a bit more rigor to some of those design decisions as we're evaluating them through the design process. And
Andrew, in Nova Scotia, is life cycle costing part of the evolution of your new schools?
I should say that we would like to see it as part. We're trying to push it forward. I know in the past, I worked in Manitoba, as I mentioned, and when we were doing our schools, I worked there from 2005 to 2018. When we were doing our schools, we did do a lot of life cycle costing, and I think it should be, definitely, and hopefully we have the personnel that can do it in Nova Scotia.
Right.
Because it's valuable information for making design decisions, and you almost need it when you're in the design process.
Absolutely. So good point to pause, and Cajun, thanks for the note. Questions from the floor, because we're going to get into is it going to cost more for schools to make them energy efficient, or is there something else in play here? Are there questions in that area, Carolyn, that would fit in here, or other questions posed to specific panelists?
Excuse me. Yeah, there's a couple that have been posed to specific panelists here. One for Andrea from Alexi Karamanos from Efficiency Nova Scotia, asking what steps can we take to make the handoff more seamless from DPW to the RCEs, and what work can we do to align the goals of both organizations as early as possible in the design process?
So we've just started using the Efficiency Nova Scotia commercial building program in our most recent schools. And so we really haven't gotten to the handoff process yet. But I see using that program as we move forward for all of our schools. And probably setting up a meeting to discuss it with us would be a great idea. Where the challenges are.
Sounds like a date.
Yeah.
Carolyn?
Yeah, there's another one here from Ken Gibson. He's with Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance, and this is directed to Steve. Does Halton focus on project delivery methods that are more collaborative than traditional design, bid, build?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We, as I kind of mentioned off the top when I was speaking earlier, as a department, all of our construction and facilities are all embedded into the same department. So that makes us very agile to make decisions very quickly that way. We do solicit feedback from, educators and that when we go into designing new schools. But largely, I would say that our collaboration involves our own team here in facilities, as well as heavily leaning on the architects and engineers that we have come to work with and value over the last number of years. I know the data that I sent to some of the people on this call here would show you that we definitely have our preferred engineering group and preferred architects. And again, that has paid dividends for us because we can take designs that we've done previously, not have to reinvent the wheel, and take those designs and maybe tweak them slightly, and take that stakeholder feedback and make some tweaks to see based on what worked and what didn't work maybe in the last design or two. So that would, we say, where our collaboration is.
Great. And one more question here. This is from Maya Puccetti at TDSB, so Toronto District School Board, asking how important has it been to receive additional capital funding for building new energy efficient schools above the usual capital funding model? That wasn't directed to anyone specific, so any one of our school boards maybe could answer that one.
Yeah, Andrea, could I ask you to take a look at that? Is the conversation about putting more budget into schools that are more efficient? Has that been necessary?
Yeah, there was some discussion on that, and I believe that it increased some of the budgets to allow for some sustainable elements. So I know the government has considered it, increasing the budget slightly.
And Luke, what's happening in BC?
I will preface this by saying that the whole process for capital project delivery with schools is in flux at the moment. There has been a shift, just back to one of the earlier points about who's funding projects, and school construction is now the responsibility of the Ministry of Infrastructure. And one of the project we're currently got on the works is an elementary school. And at that time, during design a year and a half or so ago, we were able to unlock an additional 3% capital funding from what was then the Ministry of Education and Childcare, the funder, to achieve a 50% greenhouse gas reduction. So there was an offer of additional capital funding, recognizing some premium costs involved with taking a more progressive approach.
There are a couple more, more around carbon tax here. We have one from Adrian Morab, asking, the consumer carbon tax was a driver towards electrification. Do you have a sense whether school board decision makers are going to use the removal of the consumer carbon tax to end electrification efforts?
Oh boy. It sounds like a political question.
It could be a little bit. We can perhaps take it offline and answer it in a document afterwards.
I mean, we could play our way through this, and these are, I guess, personalized observations. Governments only have limited levers to move the economy into a low carbon direction. The financial one is self-evident. Grants, incentives on the carrot side. On the stick side, the carbon tax just became so toxic that it's not being touched anymore. We then pivot because we still have to collectively save the world, right? So the planet doesn't care what we're doing with carbon taxes or anything else. The problem remains. So that's why we're seeing the whole area of codes and standards and the work that all of you are doing being so vitally important, that because that's another lever. And if one goes away, the other comes back because the problem doesn't go away. But say the idea of using the financial stick, that's become toxic, and clearly we're not going to be going down that path anytime soon.
And I'll go with two more questions here. This first one, I think we already answered. It was from an anonymous attendee asking, does any jurisdiction or sector use LEED standards? And are they included in the new code updates? I believe we have heard that some do build to LEED silver or LEED gold, but does anyone want to comment towards that?
Yeah, Luke, if I could turn to you again.
Sure, sorry, I was a bit distracted trying to answer a question in the chat there, but the question was around use of LEED standards, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so we
there's-
have in British Columbia, we did have for the longest time a mandate for all new provincial projects to achieve LEED Gold. It actually stemmed from the throne speech of a premier many years ago, and that was used as the cornerstone of the strategy for many new projects for many years. And I will say the enforcement of that and the requirement to actually certify wasn't overly strong. And although we as a school district did certify a number of projects in the early days, our desire to certify projects did waver a little bit. And we tended to try and focus on a really impactful and pragmatic approach to holistic green building performance, looking at how we can leverage the big picture, not just energy, but how can we get the most out of this process that looks at everything from materials to energy to commissioning. And so for us, we definitely utilized LEED. And I think as the new ESG framework for capital projects is more widely implemented, there is still a reference to LEED, although I don't believe it's the only approach to demonstrating holistic green building performance, but it's certainly a useful tool.
That's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. The last question we'll go with here, another one from Ken Gibson, asking, how would you anticipate the optimal project process might differ between new builds and retrofits for schools?
Was that aimed to anybody, Caroline?
Not anyone in particular, no.
Hassan, why don't you pick that up? You've got a lot of experience in this whole area of retrofits, as well as what you're doing with your new P3 schools.
Right. So I'll speak specifically to the retrofit because in the side of our new builds, we basically have inputs that we give to Alberta infrastructure, but I would say we have less control on what happens at the end. But on the retrofit side of things, I can speak to it. I'll probably pick up from the point that probably Luke mentioned, that on the retrofit side, we are basically focusing more on the life cycle costs. So again, yes, upfront costs do matter, but at the same time, when we're looking at the overall holistic picture, we're looking at a life cycle cost perspective. So for example, if you're going to be running something for a 10-year or a 15-year life cycle period, are we going to see a net present value positive on that side? Or even if it is negative, is like, how negative is it? Like, can we manage that with a grant or maybe subsidy that we can apply for? So that's something I can speak to on the retrofit side of things. Also, the other thing that we are doing right now on the retrofit side of things, and I think I'll pick up on the side of on our portfolio right now, specifically with CBE, we see that we have done a lot of work on the electricity side. So for example, we are more efficient on the electricity consumption side of things. Where we are seeing that we have a large footprint of GHG emission is basically natural gas. And on that incentive, what we are seeing is we are focusing more on the heat pump as well. So again, I believe there was a question on the chat as well regarding specifically, is the school board willing to operate new equipments, for example, air source heat pump? So we are definitely in that path. Like, we are right now going to do a design, like a pilot for a particular school where we're replacing an older furnace system with an air source heat pump. And then we are going to be also, in order to capitalize on the side that we are going to see more electricity consumption for that school, we're going to install solar in that school as well. So again, we're compensating that extra electricity consumption through solar. So again, that's kind of like the plans that we are doing for the new, I would say, for the retrofit side of things for our schools, which are not doing great on the natural gas consumption. So again, that's kind of like the plans that we're having.
Helpful, thank you. Let me pick up on this a little because I want to move on to the audience poll. So you've heard a lot of input, a lot of advice, a lot of insights, a lot of experience along the way here. But as we were running through the numbers, both if you remember from the benchmark charts there, in round numbers, if you look at the more efficient schools on those charts, or new schools, same codes, the more efficient schools compared to the median, the average, it's around 50 cents a square foot. You know, in kind of order of magnitude is there. If you play that over a 30-year life, and the fact that escalation comes in, and we don't know what carbon pricing will be over time, but the idea that over a life cycle, if you look at reasonable assumptions about carbon pricing, escalation, and so on, maybe that's worth $30 a square foot. And our impression is that schools are costing between $100 and $150 a square foot right now. You can see the economic piece in there in terms of the improved energy efficiency. I think what I've heard from especially Steve and Hassan is that the difference between those is not how much they spent on the infrastructure. It has a lot to do with the energy target, has a lot to do with commissioning, has a lot to do with the operations, has a lot to do with training, and so on. So the economic picture is there. And I just wanted to emphasize that before we move to the poll, and before even, because a lot of the response comes back, people throwing their hands up saying, we can't afford to build better. We can't afford to come up with more efficient schools. And to some extent, then we get stuck, because without more money, and there is no money available, but we can still improve the way we do things. Let me first just thank our four panelists, you know, Hassan, Andrea, Luke, Steve. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for the time you put in before this, and we'll continue. We'll continue talking as we go along, but let's move on to the poll, because again, this is an engagement today. This is not this is not a presentation. This is asking everybody on this call today to become part of this journey, part of the investigation, part of the discovery, part of hopefully getting to some real truths that can improve things over time. So we'll throw this poll up. First of all, we're going to ask everybody to identify yourselves. Everybody's opinion matters, but we're interested whether you're a school board, whether you're government, whether you're industry, or whether you're another interested stakeholder in all of this. But then the two key areas are, from everything you've heard today, from your experience, from what you already know, there are a total of kind of 9 options here. Where do you think the biggest leverage is? Where is the biggest opportunity? Where would you advise us to focus our efforts to materially make improvements to the outcomes that are coming out of new schools? So the options are there: code compliance, government regulations, financial coordination within your internal organizational alignment, or process in the area that Mark ran through with us, whether energy targets, design standards, commissioning operations, or other areas within that process. Can you improve the way things are done? So question 1. Question 2 then is, what gets in your way? If these are the areas to improve, what stops you from moving forward to improve those? Is it funding? Is it people anywhere in the mix don't have the knowledge that or the information they need? Do you just lack time and resources to get it right the first time? And do you see local disconnects with the compliance officers that are giving you your building permits? That are they necessarily on the energy performance page? So those are kind of the key issues that we'd ask you to address. Can we put the poll up now, please, Carolyn?
Yep, it should be live now.
And again, whoever you are, please take the time just to log into this and tell us. This is our marching orders for the next few months. And panelists, by the way, we hope that you'll participate in this. I think you have access to it. You know, while that's progressing, Carol, another couple more questions for panelists.
Let me just take a look here. It looks like there is maybe one more question here. Not directed to anyone specific on the panel, but asking, beyond the new construction initiatives discussed today as part of the life cycle renewal replacement over the facility use life, what guidelines or practices is included in the new build in order to sustain energy efficiency? For example, what maintenance strategies are recommended to minimize component drift or poor performance? And when should the equipment and controls be recommissioned over the useful life?
Steve, this sounds like one for you.
Sorry, I was multitasking there, Ian, but could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yep, somebody was asking, as part of the life cycle renewal replacement over the facility use life, what guidelines or practices are included in the new build in order to sustain energy efficiency? They also sort of had a two-part to that, asking what maintenance strategies are recommended to minimize component drift or poor performance, and when should the equipment and controls be recommissioned?
Well, I can speak to it from a Halton Catholic point of view. We have, to borrow a word from Luke earlier, a holistic approach on our operations here. We have a gentleman that does solely does building automation and operations of the schools, and my role dovetails with his on most days and weeks. We do tend to use our interval metering as a continuous commissioning mechanism, right? Now that we have that working for us instead of against us, it can be a deluge of information if you don't get it working for you. But now that it's all alarmed and we know exactly when energy is being used throughout the day, that aids us in our ability to continuously commission the schools. And with that other gentleman and myself, that is a large part of how we maintain our efficiency. There's alerts obviously in the BAS side of things, but we use both systems and the interval monitoring extensively to do that. As far as maintenance and that goes, it revolves around the same mechanism and systems. I can tell you right now, if tomorrow morning, if one set of lights in a school is left on, or a fan was left in hand as opposed to an auto, those kind of operational transparency helps us also guide our maintenance as to where we need to go for, and oftentimes it is dictated by the age of the school, but our renewal work often centers around things that are and equipment that's at the end of their life cycle too. So, but we tend to use those systems to guide a lot of our decision-making and our day-to-day work here, and just being, relatively competent in our jobs as well helps.
And Steve, when do you know when a building automation system needs an upgrade?
Like a lot of our refresh projects, we typically pair a lot of these things together. So when we're just kind of finishing off a raft of heat pump terminal unit refreshes and upgrades, getting close to the end of those, but those are all at end of life. When we do those, we do the BAS, we do the lighting and network controls all as one, and that's kind of how we encapsulate a refresh project here at Halton Catholic.
And for clarity, we talked very briefly in the middle there about the usefulness of interval metering as a learning process, as a monitoring process, where you can see the hourly changes in gas consumption, electrical consumption. I think what you're saying is that usefulness continues. I believe you have your own system that Halton Catholic purchased to track electricity and gas usage in that way going forward. So not only for setting up the new school to ensure that it's operating as intended, but then that's a key monitoring tool for you on a go-forward basis to make sure it keeps running efficiently. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's a lot that I can get into here. I'll keep it brief, but generally speaking, that system allows us to compare and contrast schools, right? So if we have schools that were built a couple years apart, or indeed even at the same time, that helps that tool if they're two different times that they've been commissioned, or one was in the process of being commissioned, you have a target or something to look at. With the previous school maybe that we've got the monitoring set up at, and it's fully commissioned. So there's power there. We are in a lot of growth here in Southern Ontario, and particularly in some of our municipalities, are in extreme growth. So we have a lot of portable classrooms. We were able to sub-meter a lot of those classrooms, and I can tell you one of our schools, for example, in Milton has 50 portables. That's 50 portables alone. So that makes things fairly hard to compare and contrast to a school that has 0. So we're able to kind of net those out, so to speak, and look at the building itself and then look at the portable separately. So the sub-metering and the panel level sub-metering certainly helps you be a little bit more of that Sherlock Holmes, wear that Sherlock Holmes hat and be able to, you know, figure out where the opportunities lie on a go-forward basis.
And the proof of the pudding is always in the same place, isn't it? Halton Catholic, the most energy efficient school board in Ontario. So it's not inexpensive putting in place a full metering. We're not talking sub-metering, we're talking the main meters here. But clearly that's a key tool to enable you, again, to make sure the new schools turn out right and to manage the whole portfolio of schools on a go-forward basis.
It's absolutely critical, and as part of a, you know, when you look at the cost of the interval metering compared to the overall cost of the project, it's a drop in the ocean.
Right. So let's end the poll, Carolyn, because we're coming close to the end of time. I want to just do a quick closing for everybody about what comes next. Like, where are we going from here? And again, we're hoping this is an engagement for most of you today, that you'll stay involved. So I can take that off my page. So you know, in the conversation so far, the, you know, next steps, and again, we try to always avoid being preachy, but self-examination. We'd love everybody to reflect on what we've heard today in the same way as we reflect on it every day. So what's happening? What are we learning? We believe that for everybody on this call today, collectively, we've got true best practices there, and we can uncover them by sharing, by putting the information together, by helping us filter it through. We'd love you to stay in touch. We'll give you our contact information in a moment, but what insights have you drawn out of today? So there's a fair amount in the Q&A, but what other insights have you learned? Send us an email, send us a 2-liner, whatever it might be. And especially, what did you conclude? So our hope is that everybody will have got something out of today where they can take action tomorrow, because that urgency, that opportunity, that responsibility, those are still with us. So let us know where you're going, and we will be reaching out to a number of you for these stakeholder meetings to talk specifically about your data, about your experience, about your best practices. In the next couple of months, we're going to be looking at underperforming schools. We'll be picking some of those at the bottom of that chart and talking to the school boards involved. Are you interested? Let's dig a bit deeper and see what went wrong. And with the new schools, the commitment that comes to, if we get it right, every one of our schools should be at the top of the chart. So our forever request here is people leave here saying, we know how to do this. We know how to actually reach tier 3 and tier 4 of the new National Energy Code right now. Let's make the commitment to make it happen. The regional charrettes will be, we have a couple of conversations going on right now, is the opportunity to bring together governments, designers, builders, operators, and talk about top performing schools, what it takes to keep them there. So watch out for that. And we hope many of you will be involved in those things. I mentioned our geothermal cohort project, where we're planning to begin that this month coming up, and it'll be a 2-year effort looking to establish what works, what doesn't work, where does it apply, where doesn't it apply, and how big a role can geothermal play in the low carbon future for these areas. And Mark, we're going to be interested in learning your experience in Alberta around that. Final words, or please stay in touch. Again, we know where to reach you. We'll let you know as our events are coming up, but as you learn more things, please stay connected. Let us know what you're finding. And when we say us, Caroline, can we go to the final slide, please? This is us again. I'm Ian Jarvis. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Challenge Network. Gillian is the executive lead for this whole undertaking. Katia is the project manager. Mark is leading the work with educational facilities. Cajun has the overall technical responsibility for the whole thing. We're looking forward to a successful outcome for K-12 schools later this year. Once again, my deepest appreciation to our panelists for sharing so willingly what's working and sometimes what's not working within your individual organizations. And to everybody, thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful day.